Taking a look at the running back fits for the Buccaneers in this year's draft class, that and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Tuesday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, plus one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. A hypothetical trade is being thrown around that we are going to discuss how realistic and how beneficial it may be. But first, let's talk about the top 5 running back fits for the Buccaneers in the upcoming draft. So as I have discussed many times on this show, the Buccaneers still have to add another running back, even after re-signing Chase Edmonds. He and Rachaad White on their own are not enough. Sean Tucker did not pan out the way the Bucs had hoped and ended up not contributing much at all throughout the season. Keyshawn Vaughn was, of course, shown the door. So we're down to really just 2 running backs on the Bucs. And as I have also mentioned, the Buccaneers need to find a guy that offers something that neither White or Edmonds can offer. Someone that has a track record of being really reliable in short yardage situations, goal line situations, but that can also catch out of the backfield and pick up blitzes so that the opposing defense doesn't know what's coming based on the limitations of the running back in the game. So you're looking for something a little bit different, but also somebody that can do everything the way Rachaad White and Chase Edmonds both can. I always bring up the Charles Sims days because he was so limited in his abilities that Dirk Cutter would essentially tell the defense what was coming by even checking him into the game, and you cannot have that in today's NFL. So who are some of these complete backs that add a layer to the Bucs offense that they can find starting on late day 2? And I say late day 2 because the earliest I think I would want to see the Buccaneers take a running back is with one of their picks in the 3rd round, preferably their second of their 2 third-round picks. Now, could they take one sooner? Absolutely. But with the need at edge rusher and the need at guard, those should take priority. And then really depending on how the board falls, you could go safety, cornerback, linebacker, another edge rusher, wide receiver with one of those picks in the 3rd round. So there's a lot of directions that they can go, but I am looking for late day 2 and into day 3 running backs as my best fits for the Buccaneers in this draft class. So let's start with Michigan running back Blake Corum, and he's probably right on the edge of being in play for the Buccaneers in the 3rd round. My guess is that Jonathan Brooks and Jalen Wright are going to be the first 2 running backs off the board. And then Blake Corum is probably going to be the 3rd running back, depending on what teams are looking for. But he's gotten better every year at Michigan, finishing last year with 1,245 yards, 4.8 yards per carry, and 27 touchdowns. 27. That is so many. He finished with 3,737 yards and 58 touchdowns on the ground while adding 56 receptions, 411 yards, and 3 touchdowns in the receiving game. 12 of his 45 rushing touchdowns over the last 2 years were for more than 5 yards. He was one of the best, arguably the best and most efficient short yardage runners in all of college football. He's quick at finding running lanes, no matter how small they are, and he hits them quickly and decisively. And while he's on the smaller side, 5'8", 200 pounds, that plays into his advantage of being able to get through some of these smaller creases along the offensive line to get into space, to find daylight through those running lanes and be able to get to the second level. He's also not shy about taking on blitzing linebackers in pass protection. So while his pass protection does need a little bit of work, that tends to be the norm for most rookie running backs. And Blake Corum does have experience and a fearlessness in that part of his game. So again, Blake Corum probably right on the cusp of being in play for the Buccaneers. But to me, and you guys know we're going to talk about him coming up in a little bit, he's probably, to me, the best fit for the Buccaneers. Not my personal favorite, but if I'm taking an objective look at this, Blake Corum, it should probably be the number one running back on Bucs fans' wish list for them to be able to draft. Second, I'm going to talk about Raymond Davis, better known as Ray Davis, out of the University of Kentucky by way of Vanderbilt and Temple. Obviously, this is a name that's going to come up a lot due to the familiarity with offensive coordinator Liam Cohn, who coached him last year with the Wildcats. So Ray Davis went for 1,129 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground while averaging over 5.5 yards per carry. Through the air, Ray Davis added 33 receptions for 323 yards and another 7 touchdowns. Davis actually had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. He went for 1,042 yards and 5 touchdowns for Vanderbilt in 2022. Again, a little on the smaller side, 5'9", 216, but he ran a 4.52 40 at the combine. And one of his best attributes is his vision mixed with his patience. He isn't always moving at full speed. Instead, he's very calm and calculating in the way he uses his short bursts to be able to get through openings and get to the second level before he hits that full speed, usually in about 2 steps. He's already up to that really, really quick 4.5 speed. The big benefit that Ray Davis has is already knowing the offense the day he walks in the door and having an offensive coordinator that knows how to best use him. You cannot overstate the familiarity and trust in one another from already having time to develop that relationship. And seeing how successful Ray Davis was with Kentucky last year compared to, and I'm not saying he wasn't successful at Vanderbilt or Temple, but he had more total touchdowns in 1 year with Kentucky than in 4 years with Temple and Vanderbilt. And he had just 1 fewer rushing touchdown in that Kentucky season versus the other 4 combined. So Cohen got the absolute best out of Ray Davis, figured out exactly how to maximize his strengths and his abilities, and he might want to have some of that with him in Tampa. Going to jump over to the chat really fast before we hit that first break. Scotty J in the chat says, Samaje Perine, go get that beast. I don't know. I like Perine, but I don't know if he's what the Buccaneers need now. They really need to go with somebody that is younger that you can draft and develop, because you may not have Rachaad White after this contract. You may not have him for the long term if he hits free agency. You're going to want a young running back to kind of take the helm as the RB1. Samaje Perine is not that dude. If they hadn't re-signed Chase Edmonds, I'd be with you, but they have to draft one now at this stage in the game. Stu J, recent insider, said, went live on my lunch break. Perfect. I'm here for you, Stu. I'm here for you, buddy. Jared says Coach Bowles said it was one of his chess pieces, so I don't think they are going to get rid of him. Jared is talking about the hypothetical Joe Tryon-Shoyinka trade that we are going to get to coming up in a little bit. But first, the rest of my top running back fits for the Buccaneers coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It can be easy to ignore our social battery and spread ourselves thin, especially with social gatherings picking up after the winter. I know for me, between my day job, the podcast, and traveling every weekend due to my son's schedule, I find myself drained faster and faster every day, but still having to push through in all situations, telling myself it's for the greater good, regardless of how I feel in the moment, often ignoring my own needs in service of others. Speaking to someone on the outside without a personal bias in my day-to-day life can be extremely beneficial and help me reshuffle what I view as a priority versus what should actually be a priority. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Everydayers, make sure you are coming back tomorrow. Evan Klosky joins the show for WTSP Wednesday, and we are going to get his personal favorite fits for the Buccaneers, starting with the first round all the way through day 3. He's going to pick out a couple of guys that are going to be available in those rounds and tell you who he likes best for the Buccaneers. But are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so far, we've talked about Blake Corum out of Michigan and Ray Davis out of Kentucky. You guys knew it was coming, so let's get it out of the way now. Audric Estime out of Notre Dame. He is probably still my personal favorite running back in this draft and absolutely one of my favorite fits for the Buccaneers, especially at the price that it'll probably cost. According to most projections, Estime appears to be falling to the 4th round, and he didn't do himself any favors with his 40-yard dash at the scouting combine where he ran a 4.71. Now, he improved that at Notre Dame's pro day. He ran a 4.58. But the thing about Estime is that he has game speed. We've talked about that on the show for years and years, David and I, the difference between 40 times and real game speed. And Estime is game fast. Once he's got a head of steam, he is going to punish anybody that gets in his way. And Lance Zierlein of NFL.com said that trying to tackle him when he's at full speed is the equivalent of trying to tackle a compact car. So his production speaks for itself. 1,341 yards and 18 touchdowns on the ground, along with 17 receptions for 142 yards in the air last season. Back-to-back seasons at Notre Dame where Audric Estime had double-digit rushing touchdowns. He also caught every target thrown his way throughout the time with the Fighting Irish. Audric Estime can pass protect. He's a short yardage monster. He can get through to the second level and just absolutely flatten guys, in that second, in that third level, along the same lines of Derrick Henry. And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not comparing Estime to Derrick Henry. I'm just saying his combination of size, strength, power, and speed allows him that even though he's not the fastest guy, Once he gets into that level, he's so hard to take down that he can end up going for 60 yards and a touchdown. In fact, Zerline, speaking of not comparing him to Derrick Henry, Zerline named his NFL comparison as Jamal Williams, which isn't anything at all to be upset about. I would argue that he can have the kind of scoring season that Williams had 2 years ago with the Lions, but that he's more athletic. So Audric Estime is a bruiser. He can be a guy that the Bucs really get going in the second half of games when the defense is getting tired, and I think he's worth the 92nd pick that the Bucs got from Detroit, but it's going to be based mostly on how the running back prospects are coming off the board. They may feel that they can wait until day 3, and they very well could. Me personally, if I'm pulling the trigger, I would be comfortable taking him at 92, but we know crazy things end up happening in the draft. Next up is a guy that I've seen a lot of you mention. In fact, destined for greatness in the chat. The running back I like the most in this draft is Lloyd from USC. Well, he is next up on my list, Marshawn Lloyd. So Marshawn Lloyd doesn't have some of the big eye-popping numbers that these other backs that I have talked about have, but he is an absolutely incredible athlete and can excel in the right scheme in the NFL. He had just 816 yards and 9 touchdowns last year, but that marked the second consecutive season that he had 9 touchdowns. He did it in 2022, but he did it for South Carolina before transferring to USC last year. Over his time with South Carolina and USC, Marshawn Lloyd had 1,621 rushing yards and 19 touchdowns to go with over 5.5 yards per carry. Last year with USC, he rushed for 7.1 yards per carry. He also had 34 receptions for 452 yards and 2 touchdowns over his 3 years. He's a sub 4.5 speed, definitely a bonus. And while he doesn't have great pass catching numbers, that doesn't mean that he can't do it. Much like when David Harrison and I talked about Ezekiel Elliott way back during his draft process, it wasn't that Zeke couldn't catch the ball. It's just that he wasn't asked to. Marshawn Lloyd is, he wasn't asked to do that a lot, but he is a physical runner. You mix that with his sub 4.5 speed, and he's going to be a really interesting NFL running back. I wouldn't pull the trigger on drafting him before day 3, but he could be a really nice addition to the rotation, especially for a day 3 guy. So one more quick recap. Blake Corum out of Michigan, Ray Davis out of Kentucky, Audric Estime out of Notre Dame, Marshawn Lloyd out of USC, and then finally Braelon Allen out of Wisconsin. And he's interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, he is by far the biggest of the running backs that I've talked about, 6'2", 250 pounds. This guy is a handful. He's also one of the younger running backs in this class and one of the youngest players in the draft class overall, 20 years old. Braelon Allen ran for over 1,200 yards in both 2021 and 2022, then rushed for 982 yards last season when Wisconsin changed its offensive philosophy. Back-to-back years of 5.8 yards per carry and double-digit touchdowns in all 3 years at Wisconsin. Modest receiving numbers, 49 receptions, 275 yards over the 3 years. He can do it, but again, wasn't asked to do it a lot with the Wisconsin Badgers. Also, nice little fun fact, he was 2 for 3 for 33 yards and a touchdown passing the ball as a member of the Wisconsin Badgers. So Braelon Allen had one of the highest success rates in college football in short yardage situations, which again is something that I would be looking for in a running back if I'm Todd Bowles and Jason Light. He's already a solid pass blocker, has no fear stepping up and laying a helmet on blitzing players. And again, that's where kind of his really, really solid size comes in. And also his fearlessness is rare in a player as young as he is. I'm probably not pulling the trigger here until day 3, much like with Marshawn Lloyd, but Braelon Allen absolutely could be a contributor in a rotation as a day 3 pick. Going to jump in the chat one more time before we hit this next break. Stu J in the chat says, I could see a 92nd pick up unless they use that extra pick they have to use as some leverage to move up absolutely in play. And again, all of this is predicated on how the board falls. If you start to see a run on edge rushers or you start to see a run on interior offensive linemen, the Bucs are going to get aggressive and move up to get their guy. So all of this is predicated on what other teams are doing that we don't know what they're going to do, who the Bucs have marked as players that they really like. All I can do is tell you the players that I really like, that I believe fit the team. And then, of course, you have to read and react to the situations that are going on. That's why draft weekend is so fun. It is the coolest soap opera there is alongside sports in general, because there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of unknown, and then there's always wild surprises. Destined for greatness. I could see Allen going to the Chargers if they don't go with Corum. I absolutely could see that as well. And of course, the Chargers are interested in J.K. Dobbins, who is visiting the Kansas City Chiefs as we are live this Tuesday afternoon. So potential for J.K. Dobbins over there in Los Angeles with the Chargers. Absolutely, Corum is in play with Jim Harbaugh out there in Los Angeles. But recapping a hypothetical trade that was floated out there that is starting to garner some fan support on social media. That is next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing with America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, over-unders. You can even pick who's going to win it all. We are down to the final four, with UConn looking unstoppable as the overall favorites at -190, followed by Purdue at +195, Alabama at +1600, and the NC State Wolfpack with the longest remaining odds of +1800, despite having the darling of the tournament in DJ Burns. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet college hoops until they cut down the nets. Wrapping things up here on a live Tuesday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast. Going to jump over to the chat real quick because I see an interesting comment. G Vegas says Light may not go after a USC running back on day 2 since that didn't work out with Ronald Jones. Light seems like he avoided high picks busts from some schools and positions. Here's the thing, and I realize this is kind of ironic coming from the guy who always says don't ever draft a quarterback from Ohio State, but you draft the player, not the helmet. So it doesn't matter about Ronald Jones no longer being with the Buccaneers. And if you go back to the Super Bowl season, Ronald Jones had a phenomenal year, but couldn't seem to replicate that the following season. It doesn't matter that players didn't work out from those schools in the past. They wouldn't avoid a linebacker from LSU because things didn't shake out with Devin White the right way. They wouldn't avoid a quarterback from Florida State because Jameis Winston didn't work out. You have to evaluate the player, how he fits with your franchise, how he would fit in the locker room, how he would fit with the coaching staff and the scheme that you are bringing him into. So I don't think Ronald Jones would play any factor whatsoever into whether or not the Bucs would be interested in Marshawn Lloyd. Just, for future reference, that's my opinion on it. That's pretty much the general consensus. Just because you draft a bust from a school doesn't mean that the next guy at the same position is also going to be a bust. But over the last few days, there's been a hypothetical trade proposal floating around that has Bucs fans talking, and I figured I would give my thoughts on it. So Bleacher Report's Alex Ballentine proposed that or it could be Ballentine. Alex, if you're listening to this, I apologize if I butchered your last name. With a last name like Yarcho spelled the way it is, I'm used to it. But again, I apologize if I mispronounced that. But Alex Ballentine proposed that the Buccaneers trade Joe Tryon-Shoyinka to the Dallas Cowboys in exchange for the Cowboys' fifth-round pick, number 174 overall. Valentine said, quote, "At this point, the Cowboys' options are fairly limited. They don't have a ton of cap space, and most of the obvious trade chips this season have already been swapped. But someone like Joe Tryon-Shoyinka profiles as under-the-radar trade fodder. He's entering the final year of his rookie contract, and he's been underwhelming since the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took him with the 32nd pick in the 2021 NFL Draft. They can find another edge defender in the draft, but it's going to be hard to find one ready to contribute with the fifth-round pick they'd be sending to Tampa. They can go to free agency, but there aren't many 24-year-olds with the potential to find a new level of production on the market. For the Bucs, this would be a chance to move on and get something in return for a player that they benched last season. Not totally true. For the Cowboys, it's an opportunity to take a relatively low-cost risk on a high-potential player," end quote. I get how this makes sense for the Cowboys, but I don't think this proposal makes sense for the Buccaneers, and here's why. First, the Buccaneers are already razor thin at edge rusher, and having to find not only a starter, but then a replacement for Tryon-Shoyinka is going to change their flexibility in the draft. It's going to affect their depth. It's going to affect a lot of things. And yes, they'd be picking up a fifth-round pick, which they don't currently have one of those, but is that enough to make a weak position group even weaker? I don't think so. Second, it's a point that Valentine makes on the Cowboys side, but it also applies to the Bucs. He only cost $2.2 million this season. Why would you give up a player that you at least know what he can do for you for an unknown that may not even make the roster? It's that whole bird in the hand is worth two in the bush cliche. And then finally, I go back to Todd Bowles at the owners' meetings talking about Joe Tryon-Shoyinka as one of his chess pieces and having a plan for him this season that he can move all over the field, do a lot of things for the Bucs defense this year, and that Bowles knows how he wants to use him at this point in time. To me, it's worth the $2.2 million cap hit to see if Bowles' plan works. And we get that big step out of JTS that Jason Light was hoping for and looking for last year. I don't think that pick 174 is worth that risk. And no, I don't think the Bucs could get a day 2 pick or something like that for Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, but it just seems that the Bucs are going to be better off not moving Joe Tryon-Shoyinka because it's going to affect so many different things that the Bucs are going to be able to do. It's a low risk, high reward move for the Cowboys, but it's also a low risk, high reward move for the Bucs to just keep him. If he does what he's done every season, fine. You know what you have, you know what to expect, and nothing changes. But if Bowles is right and moving him around and utilizing him in these different ways as one of his chess pieces actually ends up paying dividends, then that's a facet of your team that you would have lost for pick 174. And yes, I'm sure I could scroll through the last 20 years of NFL drafts and find a couple of Pro Bowlers taken at pick 174. But I'm going to find a lot more guys that probably aren't even in the league that were taken with that pick compared to what you already have. So again, I realize that there's frustration surrounding Joe Tryon-Shoyinka. I understand that he didn't pan out to be the edge rusher that a lot of people wanted him to be, but to give him away for pick 174 in this hypothetical alternate universe that I'm sorry, I forgot his name already. Alex Ballentine has put out there trying to find the Cowboys an edge rusher. You're better off keeping him. And if he works out, awesome. If he doesn't, well, then you're probably going to get that 4 to 5 sack that you got every year. And he's going to hit free agency next year. And it's really no big deal. So that's my thoughts on this, proposed trade that apparently just wouldn't stop picking up steam. And I don't really know why, but I figured I would go ahead and address it. I'm sure some of you have read about it or thought about it or talked about it on social medias. That's my opinion. No, it's not worth trading Joe Tryon-Shoyinka for a 5th-round pick to send him to the Dallas Cowboys. Not only that, but if he does blow up, you really want him to be in the same conference as you come playoff time? I don't. So, again, those are my thoughts on it. Going to jump into the chat one more time. Destined for greatness in the chat. Spot on with your analysis, James, as usual. Buddy, I appreciate you. Not everyone's going to agree with me, and that's okay. That's why we have these conversations. And, if you disagree with me, great. That's fine. I just ask that you disagree with me in a respectful way in the chat, or I'm going to have to ban you like a certain, person that wouldn't let things go. And I'm sure some of you in the chat can figure that out. G Vegas says maybe JTS will be a late bloomer. Hassan Reddick was like that. There have been plenty of late bloomers. I'm mostly interested to see the way that Todd Bowles wants to utilize him as one of his quote unquote chess pieces. Again, you have edge rusher as a major need. And if somebody goes down, you still have the versatility of Joe Tryon-Shoyinka to go back to that role. But in the meantime, you can move him all over the field, and Todd Bowles can use him in any way that he really wants to. Last one. Jimbo Schrump says Joe is slow and misses the play every time. He doesn't miss every time. But again, I understand your frustration because there are plays that he's left out there on the field. There are sacks that he missed. One of the big things that I talked about coming out of the 2022 season was that we saw the pressures. Those needed to be turned into sacks. They weren't. So again, Jimbo, I completely understand where you're coming from. At the same time, I don't think that it's worth giving him up for a 5th-round pick at this stage. You roll with him. You hope that Bowles figured it out. And if not, he's going to hit free agency and he's going to move on anyway. Speaking of moving on, that's going to do it for this episode. Please make sure that you are checking out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. We have our daily prospect profile series happening this morning. On Tuesday, I dropped my profile on Audric Estime, the running back that I talked about on this show, and a running back that I've talked about quite a bit. Full profile on him over at BucsNation.com. Follow everything on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at JYarcho_Bucs. Become an insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.